I think there is a misperception that there is a vast amount of vote fraud out there.
We don't have large incidents of fraud.
Because there was no voter fraud.
There is no real fraud.
Well, they're liars. I mean, there's no other word for them. They're liars. I've seen it. I proved it in federal court. I've seen it with my own eyes. I document it on a weekly basis. They're liars.
And there are all of these dead people and illegals on the voting rolls, which you and I both know is a complete falsehood.
We have 2 million dead people on our voter rolls. 2 million, according to the Pew Research Center. I believe in honoring our dead. I do not believe they deserve representation without respiration.
They say vote fraud doesn't happen. What about the Democrats' own candidate for Congress in Maryland?
Maryland congressional candidate Wendy Rosen resigned when officials reportedly discovered acts of voter fraud in Maryland and Florida. Officials found that Rosen has been registered to vote in both Florida and Maryland since at least 2006, and in fact voted in national elections in both states.
Voted in Maryland and Florida in the same series of elections at the same time, again and again. This is an outrage.
Detroit is a perfect example. Kwame Kilpatrick was a completely corrupt Detroit mayor. He's on trial right now in federal court for corruption. Well, he ran for re-election, and a reform candidate from the city council ran against him, Freeman Hendricks, and he may have won. But there was massive voter fraud. We know this. Absentee ballot fraud, people going into Alzheimer's homes, and basically collecting votes from people who really couldn't think or speak for themselves. The fraud was so bad, the city clerk of Detroit, in charge of the elections, Jackie Curry, had to be removed from office by the state of Michigan.
Political machines are skilled at voter manipulation and targeting specific cities that can be counted on to deliver winning numbers. Adams calls these Spigot cities.
The systemic and institutional way that these places are used to win elections is a completely unreported story. It's reported to the extent that people think it's a good thing. You know, the turnout in Philadelphia, everybody's getting the right to vote. What they leave out of the equation is the criminality that's occurring in places like Philly during elections. You have election officials telling voters for whom to vote. You have forced assistance. You have busloads of people losing their right to vote as they are marched into the polling place and has somebody else mark their ballot for them.
If it's a risk-free activity, people will often do it for the $20 that are handed at a homeless shelter, and they're told to get in a bus and go from polling place to polling place casting votes.
Without the spigot being opened in Philly, without the spigot being opened in St. Louis, without the spigot being opened in Detroit and Fort Lauderdale and places around the country like that, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Cincinnati, those states would not go blue. It requires massive turnout in large unopposed numbers in those urban centers for those states to remain in the blue column. What you have, unfortunately, is pervasive systemic voter fraud in many of those places. I've seen it with my own eyes.
In 2008, Spigot cities were well managed by the Obama campaign, with a little help from the voting section of the Justice Department.
His campaign was on the phone regularly with Chris Coates, making demands of the Justice Department. Bob Bauer, the campaign counsel, was regularly calling the voting section, asking for certain things to be done about certain problems that the Obama campaign had around the country.
There's an attempt here at all phases of this campaign to smear, and this is a smear on voters. It's an attempt to discourage people from voting, to drive them away from the polls.
The main problem centered on having an adequate number of voting machines at the ready in the event a precinct suddenly was flooded with voters.
This is a great illustration of the model that was in play in 2008. The department lawyers stayed within the four corners of the law. We weren't interested in pursuing either a partisan agenda or pushing the frontiers of the law. We followed what the law was. But you need to understand the McCain campaign did nothing. They had a policy to never ever call the voting section about anything. It was an articulated policy within the McCain campaign. So you had one side using the DOJ as a potential lever to help them gain power, and you had the other side fleeing from the battlefield.
Another major issue for those who run political machines is voter ID.
Controversial voter ID law.
Cumbersome rules.
It does disenfranchise a lot of people.
They will continue to fight the constitutionality of the law.
Their only concern is
large minority turnout. And so they will oppose any voter ID law, no matter how reasonable it is.
Critics of voter ID laws claim they are racist because some may have trouble getting identification.
All the research shows is that a disproportionate number of minorities do not have the types of identification that these laws are requiring.
The Brennan Center and some other liberal groups claim 25% of African Americans don't have an ID. That's preposterous. You have to have an ID.
My goodness. I can't rent a car. Check into a hotel. I can't cash a check. Open a bank account. Without an ID, something as sacred as voting, friend, you better have one.